The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting a warm orange glow over the small town of Willow Creek. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, where life moved slowly, and secrets were buried just beneath the surface. At the edge of town, nestled between the tall pines, stood the old lighthouse. It had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Once a beacon for ships, guiding them safely through the rocky shores, it had fallen into disrepair when the harbor was abandoned and the sea traffic stopped. Yet, even though no one ever spoke of it, the lighthouse still stood, a silent sentinel against the ever-changing world. But on this particular evening, something was different. The lighthouse wasn't just standing, it was calling. Maggie Thompson, a young journalist in her late 20s, had heard the rumors. She'd grown up in Willow Creek, but she'd left for college, leaving behind the small town that had always felt too quiet, too confined. Now, after a few years of working at the local paper in the city, she had returned to visit her aging father and take a short break from the fast-paced life. She'd grown used to, but the town had changed. It wasn't the same as she remembered. There were whispers, strange occurrences, and a sense of unease that seemed to hang in the air like a fog. And of course, there was the lighthouse. People talked about it more now than they ever had. Some said it was haunted. Others claimed it had a hidden treasure, buried deep within its walls, waiting to be discovered. Maggie had always been the curious type, the kind of person who couldn't resist a mystery. So, when her father mentioned that the lighthouse was coming alive again, her interest was piqued. She decided to investigate, if only to satisfy her own curiosity. She walked down the dirt path that led from her father's house toward the lighthouse. The path was narrow, flanked by tall trees that seemed to sway and whisper in the wind. As Maggie approached, she noticed a faint scent of salt in the air, mixed with something else. Something ancient. The lighthouse loomed ahead. Its tall, weather-beaten stone tower standing proud against the twilight sky. Its once white walls were now faded and cracked, but there was something imposing about it. Something that called to her, as though the building itself was alive, watching her approach. Maggie hesitated at the base of the lighthouse, staring up at the crumbling structure. She could hear the sound of the wind howling through the cracks in the stone, and for a moment, it felt as though the lighthouse was breathing. But she wasn't about to turn back now. She stepped forward, pushing the creaky door open, its hinges groaning in protest. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the fading glow of the setting sun through the broken windows. Dust floated in the air, and the scent of mildew filled her nose. Maggie's heart raced as she stepped inside, her footsteps echoing off the stone walls. She could feel the weight of the place, as if it had been waiting for her. She didn't know what she was expecting to find, but she was certain there was something here. Something important. Something that had been hidden for far too long. As she walked deeper into the lighthouse, the wind outside picked up, rattling the windows and making the tower groan. A distant rumble of thunder sounded from far off, and for a brief moment, Maggie wondered if she had made a mistake coming here. But her resolve hardened. She had to know the truth. She reached the base of the spiral staircase that led to the top of the lighthouse. The stairs creaked under her weight as she began to climb, her hand gripping the cold, rusted rail for support. The higher she went, the more oppressive the air seemed, and a strange sense of foreboding crept over her. When she reached the top, she found a small, dusty room with a large, broken lantern sitting in the center. The lens of the lantern had been shattered long ago, and the metal frame was rusted and bent. Yet, there was something oddly beautiful about the broken remnants. It was as though the lighthouse had once been a beacon of hope, now reduced to ruin. But then, Maggie noticed something that made her blood run cold. On the floor near the lantern, there was a piece of old, yellowed parchment. She knelt down and carefully picked it up, her hands trembling as she unrolled it. The paper was faded, the ink almost unreadable. But there was one thing she could make out clearly: a symbol. It was a spiral, twisted and looping in on itself, surrounded by strange runes she didn't recognize. Maggie stared at it, the image seeping into her mind, making her feel dizzy and disoriented. It was as though the symbol was speaking to her, pulling her in. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. The lighthouse wasn't abandoned. It had been waiting for someone to uncover its secrets. And Maggie Thompson, it seemed, was that someone. Maggie's heart pounded as she stood in the small, dusty room at the top of the lighthouse. The ancient parchment in her hands, the symbol on the paper seemed to pulse with a strange energy, as if it had come alive. Her fingers trembled as she studied the runes around the spiral, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. What was this symbol? And why did it feel so familiar? She stood there for a few moments, the air around her growing heavier with each passing second. The wind outside had died down, and the only sound was the distant, rhythmic crash of the waves against the cliffs below. Yet inside the lighthouse, the silence felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in on her, keeping her trapped in this forgotten place. Her instincts screamed at her to leave, to get out of the lighthouse and never return. But the curiosity that had led her here refused to let go. She had come too far now to turn back. She had to uncover the truth, whatever it was. Clutching the parchment tightly in her hands, Maggie carefully retraced her steps down the winding staircase. The broken lantern cast eerie shadows on the walls as she descended, and each step seemed to echo louder than the last. When she reached the bottom, she hesitated, her mind racing with questions. Why had this symbol been left here? And who had written it? Before she could ponder any further, a sudden noise made her freeze. It was faint at first, like a low, guttural hum coming from deep within the walls of the lighthouse. The sound seemed to reverberate around her, growing louder and more intense with every passing second. Maggie's pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat. The hum was no longer just a noise. It was a vibration, a force she could feel deep in her bones. It was as though the lighthouse itself was coming to life, its very foundation shaking under the weight of something ancient and powerful. Without thinking, Maggie turned toward the far side of the room, where an old wooden door stood ajar. The door was hidden behind a thick layer of dust, but Maggie could make out the faint outline of a symbol carved into the wood. The same symbol she had just seen on the parchment. It was no coincidence. Whatever had been waiting here, whatever secrets the lighthouse held, it was time for her to find out. Maggie pushed open the door, its hinges groaning in protest as she stepped into a small, hidden chamber. The room was cold and damp, filled with the smell of salt water and decay. The walls were lined with shelves, but the shelves weren't filled with books or trinkets. Instead, they were stacked high with old, rusty metal boxes, dozens of them. Each box had a strange symbol etched into its surface. Some were the same as the one Maggie had seen, while others were different, more complex, more intricate. She walked over to one of the boxes, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. It was heavy, and the weight of it seemed to pull her in, as if it were calling to her. With a deep breath, Maggie carefully opened the box. Inside, she found what looked like an ancient stone tablet, its surface covered in faded markings that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. She couldn't make out what the markings said, but there was something undeniably powerful about the tablet. It was as if it held the answers to questions she hadn't even thought to ask. Maggie knew then that she couldn't leave the lighthouse, not yet. There were too many unanswered questions, too many secrets buried in this place. She needed to understand what was happening here, why this lighthouse had been left to decay, and why it had called her back to Willow Creek after all these years. As she examined the tablet more closely, she noticed something even more unsettling. There were other markings on the stone, markings that seemed to shift and change when she looked at them. The symbols seemed to move, as though they were alive, rearranging themselves before her eyes. Suddenly, Maggie heard a voice. It was faint at first, barely a whisper. But it grew louder, clearer, until it felt as though the voice was inside her head. "You're too late." Maggie froze, her blood running cold. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was the voice of her late grandmother, Evelyn Thompson, who had passed away several years ago. But how could this be? Her grandmother had always spoken of the lighthouse in hushed tones, as though it was something she feared. She had warned Maggie never to come here, and yet, here she was. The voice continued, its tone filled with sorrow and regret. "The lighthouse holds more than secrets. It holds a curse. You must leave before it's too late." Maggie's hand shook as she held the tablet, the voice echoing in her mind. Her grandmother had known. She had known the danger, the darkness that the lighthouse harbored. But Maggie hadn't listened. She had ignored the warnings, convinced that there was no harm in uncovering the truth. But now, as the voice faded into silence, Maggie realized she had made a grave mistake. The lighthouse wasn't just waiting for someone to uncover its secrets. It was waiting for someone to awaken what had been buried for centuries. And Maggie had just unleashed something far darker than she could ever have imagined. The air around Maggie felt thick, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. The words her grandmother had spoken echoed in her mind. The lighthouse holds more than secrets. It holds a curse. Maggie gripped the ancient stone tablet tighter, her hands slick with sweat. She had opened something, she was sure of it. But what? Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled, sending a shockwave of panic through her chest. The walls of the small chamber groaned as if something ancient was stirring, something long dormant now awakening. Maggie stumbled back, her heart racing. She needed to leave, now. But as she turned to exit the room, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. She spun around, her breath caught in her throat. The walls seemed to close in around her, as if the lighthouse itself were alive, shifting, moving, keeping her trapped inside. Maggie's pulse hammered in her ears, and her mind raced. What had she done? She couldn't just stand there and wait for the curse to take her. She had to get out, but the path was blocked. The air was thick with a sense of something dark. Something that had been watching her from the moment she stepped inside. She turned toward the shelves, scanning for something, anything, that could help her escape. Her eyes landed on one of the metal boxes, the ones that had been stacked so neatly before. One of the boxes was now open, the lid slightly ajar. It seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, the symbol etched on it pulsing with an otherworldly energy. Driven by a mixture of fear and desperation, Maggie rushed over to the box and peered inside. To her shock, there was another stone tablet, this one smaller, yet the same intricate markings covered its surface. As her fingers brushed against it, the ground beneath her shook violently, and a deep rumble echoed through the lighthouse. From the farthest corner of the room, a cold wind began to swirl. It picked up strength, whipping through the chamber like a storm, blowing dust and debris into the air. Maggie could hear something in the wind. Voices, low and mournful, whispering in a language she didn't recognize. Suddenly, the stone tablet in her hand began to glow brighter, the markings on it shifting and changing. She dropped it in horror, backing away as the wind howled louder, the voices growing more insistent. Maggie's heart was in her throat. This wasn't just a curse, it was a summoning. She turned to run, but the door wouldn't budge. The walls were alive now, pulsing with a dark energy that seemed to reach out to her. The lighthouse wasn't just a building, it was a prison that held something far worse than she had ever imagined. And now, she was trapped inside with it. Maggie's mind raced, trying to think of something, anything, that could save her. But the lighthouse was alive, its very stones bent to the will of whatever had been unleashed. She had to escape. She had to get out before it was too late. She turned back toward the shelves, her eyes darting around the room. The shelves were lined with more boxes, more tablets. She had to find something, anything, that could stop this madness. But as her eyes settled on the farthest shelf, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A familiar face. It was her grandmother's face, etched onto a stone tablet, her eyes wide with fear. The symbol surrounding her grandmother's face was the same as the one Maggie had seen on the parchment. It was unmistakable. Her grandmother had known all along. She had been trying to stop it. With shaking hands, Maggie reached out and grabbed the stone tablet. The moment her fingers touched it, the wind stopped. The rumbling ceased. The air grew still, almost eerily quiet. Maggie felt a shift in the room, like the lighthouse was holding its breath. She knew, deep down, that she had only just begun to understand the depth of the curse that had been unleashed. But she also knew one thing for certain now: she wasn't alone. Her grandmother's spirit was here, in this place, trying to protect her, even if it was too late. The stone tablet in her hands suddenly felt heavy, like it was pulling her toward something. Maggie hesitated for a moment, but then, with newfound determination, she pressed it into the center of the room. A crackling energy surged through the floor, and the walls groaned under the pressure. And then, there was silence. The air in the lighthouse seemed to settle. The walls stopped shifting. The door opened, creaking as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Maggie blinked, unsure of what had just happened. But as she looked around the room, she saw that the once pulsing symbol on the floor had disappeared. It was over. Or so she thought. Maggie walked slowly toward the door, the stone tablet still in her hand. As she stepped into the hallway, the wind picked up again, this time, faint but unmistakable. The whispers returned, louder now, calling to her. But it wasn't just the wind. Maggie's pulse quickened. She turned around, her heart pounding in her chest, and froze. The lighthouse was still alive. And it was waiting. The curse hadn't been broken. It had only just begun. With a final glance at the now darkened sky, Maggie turned and ran out of the lighthouse. The door slammed shut behind her with an eerie finality. The sun had fully set now, and the town of Willow Creek lay in darkness. As she made her way down the path, her mind raced. She had uncovered the secrets of the lighthouse, but what lay ahead was far more dangerous than she could have imagined. The curse was not just in the lighthouse. It was now out there, spreading through the town. And Maggie was the only one who knew the truth. The battle for Willow Creek had just begun, and she was going to need help. But who could she trust? The only thing Maggie knew for sure was that the lighthouse had called her here for a reason. And no matter how far she ran, she couldn't escape it. The curse was far from over. And now, it was only just beginning.